Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we'll embark on a peaceful journey through time, exploring the rise and fall of the British Empire. Before we drift into history together, a gentle reminder. If you find these bedtime stories help you relax or fall asleep, consider liking and subscribing. There's no pressure, only if it truly brings you comfort. My hope is simply to reach others who might also find peace in these journeys through the past. If you'd like to support the creation of more soothing historical content, I've created a Patreon at patreon.com/thesleepyhistorian. Your support helps keep these gentle narratives alive, and as a thank you, Patreon members receive early access to new bedtime stories before they're released publicly. But know this, your quiet listening is already the greatest gift. Now, let's settle in, take a deep breath, and allow ourselves to be carried by the slow, calming currents of time to the story of how a small island nation came to shape much of the world. Feel free to close your eyes. Let the journey begin. Imagine yourself on the shores of a small island nation, shrouded in mist and surrounded by the ever-present whisper of waves against rocky shores. Here, in this green and pleasant land, the seeds of one of history's most expansive empires were quietly taking root. The British Isles, separated from continental Europe by the silvery waters of the English Channel, would someday extend their influence to the farthest corners of the globe. But every great journey begins with a single step, and the first steps of empire were taken by explorers gazing out toward the endless horizon. As the warm glow of the Renaissance began to illuminate Europe in the 15th century, a spirit of curiosity swept across the continent. Kings and queens dreamed of discovering new lands, establishing trade routes, and extending their influence beyond the familiar shores of home. In England, a quiet transformation was taking place, one that would slowly shape this island nation into a seafaring power with ambitions that stretched far beyond its modest size. In 1497, a Venetian navigator named John Cabot sailed west from the port of Bristol on behalf of King Henry VII. His small ship, the Matthew, carried just 18 sailors as it ventured into the vast, uncharted waters of the Atlantic. The journey was long and peaceful, with only the gentle rocking of waves and the whisper of wind in the sails to mark the passage of time. After weeks at sea, Cabot's watchful eyes glimpsed the shoreline of what we now know as Newfoundland, establishing England's first claim in the New World. Cabot's voyage planted a seed in the English imagination, a seed that would blossom into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The English began to see themselves not as confined to their island home, but as potential masters of the seas, with all the opportunities that such mastery might bring. As candlelight flickered in the courts of Europe, the Tudor monarchs who ruled England began to nurture maritime ambition with increasing care. Henry VIII established the Royal Navy, creating a permanent fleet of ships that would protect English interests and carry explorers to distant shores. The dockyards at Woolwich and Deptford hummed with the soft sounds of shipbuilding, the rhythmic tapping of hammers, and the gentle creaking of timber as vessels took shape beneath skilled hands. But it was during the reign of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, with flame-red hair and a will of iron beneath her gentle demeanour, that England truly began to emerge as a maritime power. Elizabeth encouraged exploration and trade, granting charters to merchant companies and supporting the daring voyages of seafarers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. These adventurers sailed into waters dominated by the Spanish and Portuguese, challenging the established order and glimpsing possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 carried him through calm seas and stormy weather, across vast oceans and along distant coastlines. His ship, the Golden Hind, returned to England, laden with Spanish treasure and stories of lands that seemed almost beyond imagination. Elizabeth welcomed him home with quiet pride, knighting him aboard his ship as the waters of the Thames lapped gently against its hull. Meanwhile, Raleigh dreamed of establishing colonies in the Americas, naming Virginia after his unmarried queen, and planting the first fragile English settlements on the shores of the New World. Though these early attempts at colonization were modest, and some, like the lost colony of Roanoke, disappeared without a trace, they represented the first tentative steps toward an overseas empire. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a turning point in England's maritime fortunes. As Spanish ships approached English shores, a combination of skillful seamanship, favorable winds, and perhaps a touch of providence saw the smaller English fleet prevail. The victory was not marked by grand celebrations, but rather by a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power at sea was slowly shifting. England was emerging from the shadow of Spanish dominance, moving with gentle determination toward a future where British ships would sail the world's oceans with increasing confidence. As the 16th century drew to a close, the foundations of empire were being laid with patient care. The English were establishing trading posts in distant lands, forming relationships with peoples across oceans, and developing the knowledge, skills, and institutions that would support imperial ambition. The Muscovy Company traded with Russia, the Levant Company with the Ottoman Empire, and the East India Company, founded in the final days of the 16th century, would soon begin its long and transformative engagement with the Indian subcontinent. These early ventures were characterized not by conquest, but by commerce. English merchants sought trading privileges rather than territorial control, establishing relationships based on mutual economic interest. The ships that carried them to distant shores were not primarily vessels of war, but bearers of goods, wool and tin from England, silk and spices from the East, sugar and tobacco from the Americas. Scattered across the world's oceans, these merchant ships traced the first faint outlines of what would someday become a global empire. The first permanent English colony in the Americas took root at Jamestown in 1607, nestled beside a river in the verdant landscape of Virginia. The settlers faced many challenges: hunger, disease, and the complex task of building relationships with the indigenous peoples whose lands they had entered. Some did not survive the early years, but others persevered, establishing a fragile foothold that would slowly grow more secure with the passing of time. In these early colonies, we can observe the beginning of the patterns that would shape the empire for centuries to come. The colonists brought English laws, customs, language, and religious practices with them, recreating familiar social structures in unfamiliar settings. They established trade with indigenous peoples while also asserting their own cultural values. And they began the process of adapting to new environments, learning which European practices could be maintained in different climates and which needed to be modified to suit local conditions. As the soft blanket of night falls over these early explorations and settlements, we can see that the foundations of empire were being laid stone by stone, like a wall built slowly but with enduring purpose. The English were developing the maritime skills, commercial networks, and colonial experience that would eventually enable them to establish the largest empire the world had ever seen. But that empire still lay far in the future, beyond the dreams of even the most ambitious Tudor or Stuart monarch. For now, the English presence in the wider world was modest, a scattering of trading posts, a handful of small colonies, and ships that sailed to distant shores but always returned home. The transformation from island kingdom to global empire would unfold gradually, like a story told in whispers over many generations. As we drift toward sleep, carried on the gentle currents of history, we can imagine these early explorers and settlers, their faces illuminated by candlelight as they pored over maps, their ships rocking softly on foreign harbors, their eyes gazing outward toward horizons that seemed to promise endless possibility. They could not know what their actions would set in motion, or how the modest beginnings of their age would someday bloom into an empire upon which, as the saying would go centuries later, the sun never set. As dawn breaks over the rolling waters of the world's oceans, we find ourselves in the 17th and 18th centuries, a time when the first golden rays of imperial ambition began to illuminate British endeavours across the globe. Like a tide rising imperceptibly with each passing moment, British influence was spreading through trade, settlement, and increasingly through the projection of naval power. The small island nation was gradually becoming something far greater, extending tendrils of commerce and colonization to distant shores. The 17th century brought significant changes to England itself. The Stuart monarchs succeeded the Tudors, and the nation experienced the turbulence of civil war, followed by the brief republican interlude of the Commonwealth. When monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles II inherited a country whose overseas ambitions were gaining momentum despite domestic upheaval. In 1664, English forces captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York in honor of the king's brother, the Duke of York. The acquisition represented a growing pattern. British colonial expansion often came at the expense of European rivals, particularly the Dutch, French, and Spanish. Along the eastern seaboard of North America, a string of colonies took root like gardens planted with care and tended with varying degrees of attention from the mother country. Virginia and Massachusetts were joined by Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, the Carolinas, and Pennsylvania, each with its own character, some founded for profit, others as havens for religious dissenters. The colonists cleared land, built homes of timber and stone, established farms, and created communities that mirrored yet transformed English social structures. As settlers moved inland from coastal regions, they encountered indigenous peoples whose ancestors had lived on these lands for countless generations. These encounters varied widely. Some were peaceful, characterized by trade and mutual curiosity. Others led to misunderstanding, tension, and conflict. The colonists, with their European weapons and immunity to certain diseases, often held advantages that would alter the balance of power in profound and lasting ways. Across the Atlantic, on the western coast of Africa, British traders established outposts where they exchanged manufactured goods for gold, ivory, and increasingly human beings. The transatlantic slave trade cast a long, dark shadow over this period of imperial expansion. British ships transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities for European markets. This triangular trade linked Britain, Africa, and the Americas in a web of commerce where profit was prioritized over human dignity and suffering was the unspoken cost of economic gain. In the warm waters of the Caribbean, Britain acquired islands that would become valuable colonial possessions: Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and others. These islands were transformed into plantation economies dependent on enslaved labor, producing sugar that sweetened the tea and coffee increasingly favored by British consumers. The wealth generated by these plantations flowed back to Britain, funding the construction of grand country houses and fueling further imperial expansion. Meanwhile, on the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company was gradually evolving from a commercial enterprise into something resembling a state within a state. Established in 1600, the company initially focused on trade, competing with other European powers for access to Indian textiles, spices, and other valuable commodities. Company officials lived in small trading posts or factories granted by local rulers, conducting business according to local customs and recognizing the authority of the Mughal Empire and various regional powers. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked a significant turning point in the company's relationship with India. Following this victory over the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies, the company gained control over the wealthy region of Bengal, assuming the right to collect taxes and administer justice. No longer merely traders, company officials became rulers, presiding over territories and populations that dwarfed those of their homeland. As the East India Company expanded its territorial control, it employed a small army of British officers commanding locally recruited soldiers, or sepoys. The company's territorial acquisitions were often justified as necessary to protect trade interests, but the logic of empire led inexorably toward greater control. Company officials like Robert Clive and Warren Hastings found themselves wielding power that would have been unimaginable to the merchants who had founded the enterprise a century and a half earlier. The rising tide of British imperial power was most visible at sea. Following the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th century and the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century, Britain's Royal Navy emerged as an increasingly dominant force. Naval vessels protected Britain's growing trade networks, transported troops and supplies to colonial possessions, and projected power in ways that land-based armies could not match. The Navy became both sword and shield for a nation whose strength depended on maintaining open sea lanes and safe passage for merchant shipping. Naval technology improved steadily during this period, with shipwrights developing vessels that were faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than their predecessors. The officers and sailors who crewed these ships developed skills and traditions that would serve the empire well in the centuries to come. Life at sea was challenging, marked by cramped quarters, salt-preserved food, the constant motion of the waves, and the ever-present risk of storms, disease, or enemy action. But it offered opportunities for advancement that could be hard to find on land. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, demonstrated Britain's growing imperial reach and military capability. Fought across multiple continents, this conflict saw Britain and Prussia allied against France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and eventually Spain. In North America, British forces under generals like James Wolfe captured the French stronghold of Quebec, while in India, the East India Company expanded its territorial control at French expense. When peace was negotiated in the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained Canada, Florida, and various Caribbean islands, consolidating its position as the dominant colonial power in North America. Yet even as the empire reached new heights, signs of strain began to appear. The cost of fighting the 7 Years' War had been enormous, leaving Britain with unprecedented levels of debt. Attempts to raise revenue from the American colonies through measures like the Stamp Act of 1765 provoked resistance that would eventually lead to revolution. The very success of British colonization in North America had created societies that were increasingly self-confident and resentful of control from across the Atlantic. In London, the heart of this growing empire, wealth from colonial trade transformed the urban landscape. Merchants built elegant townhouses in fashionable districts, while docks and warehouses expanded to accommodate the increasing volume of global commerce. Coffee houses became centers for the exchange of news and information from across the empire, places where merchants could learn about market conditions in Jamaica or political developments in Bengal. The city hummed with activity, drawing people and goods from across Britain's colonial possessions. As the 18th century progressed, intellectual currents sometimes ran counter to the imperial project. The Enlightenment emphasis on natural rights and liberty raised questions about the morality of both colonial rule and slavery. Philosophers like Adam Smith critiqued aspects of mercantilism, the economic theory that had underpinned much of Britain's colonial policy. These intellectual challenges did not immediately alter British imperial practice, but they planted seeds of doubt that would germinate in later generations. By the late 18th century, the loss of the American colonies following the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, represented a significant setback for Britain's Atlantic Empire. The 13 colonies that declared independence in 1776 had grown from modest settlements to prosperous societies with their own distinct identities. Their successful rebellion, aided by France and Spain, demonstrated the limits of British power and the difficulties of maintaining control over distant territories occupied by determined European settlers. Yet even as Britain relinquished control over what would become the United States, new horizons of empire were opening elsewhere. Captain James Cook's voyages of exploration in the Pacific, 1768 to 1779, mapped previously unknown coastlines and established contact with peoples from Hawaii to Australia. Cook's meticulous approach to navigation and his careful documentation of the lands and cultures he encountered exemplified a more scientific approach to exploration that would characterize British imperial expansion in the coming century. Cook's reports of the vast, sparsely populated continent of Australia would eventually lead to British settlement there, beginning with the establishment of a penal colony at Botany Bay in 1788. Initially viewed as a convenient solution to overcrowded British prisons, Australian colonisation would grow into a significant imperial project, though its full development lay in the century ahead. As the 18th century drew to a close, Britain's global position was complex. The loss of the American colonies had been a blow to imperial pride and power. Yet Britain retained substantial territories in the Caribbean, had expanded its influence in India, and was beginning to look toward new horizons in the Pacific. The Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum at home, generating wealth and technological innovations that would fuel further imperial expansion. And despite the revolutionary turmoil that had engulfed France, Britain's primary imperial rival, the Royal Navy, still ruled the waves, providing the security and mobility essential for maintaining a global empire. Like a ship navigating by the stars, Britain was charting a course toward imperial dominance, guided by commercial interests, strategic considerations, technological advantages, and a growing sense of national purpose. The sun was rising on an empire that would, in the century to come, extend its reach to an extent that would have astonished even the most ambitious architects of these early imperial endeavors. As the soft light of dawn gives way to the full brilliance of day, we will see this empire reach its zenith, establishing a period of global influence known as Pax Britannica, the British peace. As the morning mist dissolves into the clear light of day, we enter the 19th century, the era when the British Empire reached its fullest flowering. Like a great oak that has grown from a modest acorn, the empire now cast its shade across vast portions of the globe. This was the age of Rule Britannia, when British power, influence, and confidence attained unprecedented heights. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," became not merely poetic flourish, but geographical reality, as British territories spanned the globe so completely that at any given moment, daylight illuminated some portion of the Queen's dominions. At the heart of this imperial age stood the diminutive figure of Queen Victoria, whose reign from 1837 to 1901 coincided with the empire's greatest expansion. Victoria ascended the throne as a young woman of 18 and would grow to become the symbolic mother of an empire that encompassed approximately 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and roughly the same proportion of its population. Her image, dignified, resolute, dressed in black following the death of her beloved husband Albert, became the human face of imperial power, reproduced on coins, stamps, and portraits that circulated throughout British territories, from Canada to New Zealand. The 19th century was a time of remarkable transformation within Britain itself. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century, accelerated dramatically, turning Britain into the workshop of the world. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow hummed with the rhythmic sounds of machinery as cotton mills, iron works, and engineering shops produced goods at a pace and volume never before seen in human history. Steam power drove this industrial miracle, with coal-fed engines powering factories, railways, and the steamships that increasingly connected the empire's far-flung territories. These technological changes altered the nature of imperial power and presence. Where earlier generations of empire builders had relied on sailing ships that might take months to reach distant colonies, Victorian Britons could travel by steamship along established routes, arriving at predictable times regardless of wind conditions. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, shortened the journey to India dramatically, allowing ships to avoid the long passage around Africa. Telegraph cables laid across ocean floors enabled messages to be transmitted nearly instantaneously between London and colonial capitals, shrinking the psychological as well as physical distance between the metropole and its dependencies. Railways, perhaps more than any other technology, symbolized the Victorian faith in progress and the transformative power of British engineering. In India, an extensive rail network gradually spread across the subcontinent, facilitating administrative control, enabling the movement of troops and goods, and altering patterns of trade and travel that had existed for centuries. The railways were marvels of engineering, with bridges spanning rivers and tracks cutting through mountain passes, physical manifestations of British technical prowess and administrative determination. India itself had become the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a traumatic event that will be discussed more fully in our next chapter, the administration of the subcontinent passed from the East India Company to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1877, a title that acknowledged the special significance of this vast and ancient land within the imperial framework. British rule in India was maintained by a relatively small number of British officials and soldiers who administered a territory containing hundreds of millions of people belonging to diverse linguistic, religious, and cultural traditions. The British presence in India manifested in various ways. Hill stations like Simla provided cool retreats where British officials could escape the heat of the plains during summer months. The architecture of imperial buildings in cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and New Delhi blended British and Indian elements, creating a distinctive Indo-Saracenic style that symbolized the cultural hybridity of the colonial encounter. Educational institutions established on British models introduced English literature and Western scientific knowledge to generations of Indian students, while Christian missionaries sought to spread their faith among populations with deep-rooted religious traditions of their own. Meanwhile, in Africa, the pace of imperial expansion accelerated dramatically during the Victorian era. Where earlier British involvement had been largely confined to coastal trading posts and the Cape Colony at Africa's southern tip, the later 19th century saw a scramble for Africa in which European powers competed to claim territory across the continent. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 established rules for this imperial competition, essentially dividing Africa among European nations with little regard for existing political boundaries or ethnic groupings. British territories in Africa included Egypt, occupied in 1882, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the territories that would later become Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. These possessions varied enormously in climate, resources, indigenous populations, and patterns of British settlement. In some areas, like Kenya's highlands, significant numbers of British settlers established farms and ranches, creating societies where racial hierarchies were rigidly enforced. In others, like Nigeria, British rule operated through systems of indirect rule, with traditional leaders maintaining positions of authority under imperial oversight. The motivations for this imperial expansion were complex and sometimes contradictory. Economic interests were certainly important. Africa offered markets for British manufactured goods, sources of raw materials like palm oil, gold, and diamonds, and opportunities for investment. Strategic considerations also played a role, particularly in Egypt, where control of the Suez Canal provided a vital link in the maritime route to India. Some Britons were motivated by humanitarian concerns, particularly the desire to suppress the slave trade, which continued in parts of Africa despite having been abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. Religious impulses also drove imperial expansion, with missionary societies establishing stations across Africa and other colonial territories. David Livingstone, perhaps the most famous of Victorian missionaries, explored large portions of Central Africa, mapping rivers and lakes while seeking to spread Christianity and commercial, legitimate trade that might replace the slave trade. His meeting with the journalist Henry Morton Stanley in 1871, immortalized in Stanley's greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," became one of the iconic moments of the Victorian imperial narrative, symbolizing British exploration of what Europeans considered darkest Africa. The expansion of British control was not limited to formal colonies. Throughout the 19th century, Britain established various forms of informal empire, exercising economic and political influence over nominally independent states. In China, following the Opium Wars, Britain gained trading privileges, control over Hong Kong, and significant influence in treaty ports like Shanghai. In the Ottoman Empire, British financial and diplomatic pressure helped maintain access to markets and strategic waterways. In South America, British investment in railways, mines, and other infrastructure created economic dependencies without the need for formal colonial rule. This was also the era of settler colonialism, when significant numbers of British emigrants sought new lives in colonies of settlement. Canada, which had remained loyal to Britain when its southern neighbours revolted, received waves of British immigrants who established farms on prairies that had previously been home to indigenous peoples and buffalo herds. Australia transformed from a penal colony to a destination for free settlers, particularly following gold rushes in the 1850s. New Zealand attracted British farmers who found its temperate climate suitable for familiar agricultural practices, though their arrival drastically altered landscapes and disrupted Maori society. These settler colonies gradually developed their own political institutions, modelled on British parliamentary democracy, but adapted to local conditions. They were granted increasing autonomy through the 19th century, evolving from colonies to dominions with responsibility for their own internal affairs, though still acknowledging the British monarch as head of state and deferring to London on matters of foreign policy. This evolution would eventually lead to the Commonwealth of Nations. But the full realization of that vision lay in the century ahead. The Victorian era also saw the emergence of a more self-conscious imperial culture within Britain itself. Empire was celebrated in literature, art, music, and public spectacle. Colonial heroes like General Gordon, who died defending Khartoum against Mahdist forces in 1885, became subjects of popular prints and memorabilia. Exhibitions displayed the diversity of imperial possessions, with pavilions showcasing products and sometimes people from different colonies. Juvenile literature promoted imperial adventure as a space where British boys could prove their manhood through courage and resourcefulness, while missionary narratives encouraged girls to imagine their own roles in the imperial project. This imperial culture was supported by ideologies that justified British dominance. Social Darwinism, which applied evolutionary concepts to human societies, suggested that the British success demonstrated their fitness as a race. The concept of the civilizing mission positioned Britain as a benevolent power, bringing progress, Christianity, commerce, and civilization to backward peoples. These ideas helped reconcile imperial expansion with Britain's self-image as a liberal society, valuing freedom and the rule of law, though the contradictions between these values and imperial practice were increasingly noted by critics at home and in the colonies. As the 19th century progressed, the costs and contradictions of empire became more apparent. The Indian Rebellion had demonstrated the fragility of British control and the depth of indigenous resistance. Wars against the Zulu, the Ashanti, the Mahdists in Sudan, and the Boers in South Africa revealed the limits of British military power and the human cost of imperial expansion. Economic benefits flowed unevenly, with British investors and manufacturers often gaining more than colonial subjects. And the racial hierarchies inherent in imperial governance contradicted the liberal principles that Britons claimed to uphold. Yet as the century drew to a close, the British Empire stood at its apparent zenith. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 provided an opportunity for imperial celebration, with colonial troops marching through London streets and colonial dignitaries paying homage to their empress. Few observers at the time could have predicted the dramatic changes that the coming century would bring. The devastating world wars, the rise of nationalist movements, and the eventual dissolution of this vast imperial structure. As the full light of day illuminates the empire at its height, we see a complex global system binding together diverse peoples, territories, and economies. The British had created administrative structures, communication networks, educational institutions, and transportation systems that fundamentally altered the societies they governed. They had projected power across oceans and continents, established trading relationships spanning the globe, and inculcated values and practices that would outlast formal imperial control. The legacy of this imperial moment would be profound and enduring, though not in ways that Victorian imperialists might have imagined. The sun of empire now stood at its zenith, casting both light and shadow across the lands beneath its rays. But like all natural cycles, after the height of noon comes the slow, inevitable movement toward sunset. In the coming chapters, we will explore how this mighty imperial structure, which seemed so permanent to those who built and maintained it, would gradually give way to new forces and new visions of the world. As the golden light of imperial noon begins its gradual transition toward afternoon, we turn our attention to the voices that questioned, challenged, and ultimately undermined the structures of British imperial power. Like persistent whispers growing slowly into a chorus, these voices of resistance emerged from different corners of the empire, speaking different languages, but expressing similar desires for dignity, self-determination, and freedom from foreign control. The story of the British Empire is incomplete without acknowledging these counter-narratives, these alternative visions of how societies might be organized and governed. Resistance to imperial authority took many forms, from armed rebellion to intellectual critique, from passive non-cooperation to the building of alternative political movements. It emerged in different times and places according to local circumstances, yet patterns can be discerned across these diverse expressions of opposition. Throughout the empire's history, those who found themselves under British rule sought ways to maintain their autonomy, preserve their cultural identity, and eventually reclaim their political independence. The American Revolution represents one of the earliest and most successful challenges to British imperial authority. The 13 colonies that declared their independence in 1776 had initially been loyal components of the empire, but a series of disputes over taxation, representation, and governance led to a rupture that could not be repaired through negotiation. The colonists, drawing on Enlightenment political philosophy and their own traditions of self-government, articulated a vision of liberty that was incompatible with continued imperial control. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, provided an intellectual framework that would inspire future anti-colonial movements. When American forces, aided by France and Spain, secured victory in 1783, they demonstrated that the British Empire was not invincible, that determined resistance could successfully challenge imperial might. The new United States offered an alternative model of governance, a republic without a monarch, a federation of states with written constitutional guarantees of rights. Across the Atlantic, resistance to British authority took different forms among enslaved populations in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution, though directed primarily against French rule, sent shockwaves throughout the region, raising fears among British plantation owners that similar uprisings might occur in their colonies. Enslaved people on British-controlled islands engaged in various forms of resistance, from everyday acts of non-compliance to occasional armed rebellions. The Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831 to 1832, led by the enslaved Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp, contributed to the growing momentum for the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, which was finally achieved in 1833. Even after legal emancipation, former slaves and their descendants continued to resist economic exploitation and racial discrimination. The Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, triggered by grievances over land access, unemployment, and the denial of political rights, was brutally suppressed by colonial authorities. The severity of this response generated controversy in Britain itself, contributing to evolving attitudes about imperial governance and responsibility. In India, the rebellion of 1857 to 1858 marked a watershed in the relationship between Britain and the subcontinent. Often called the Indian Mutiny in British accounts and the First War of Independence in Indian nationalist historiography, this uprising began with sepoys, Indian soldiers, in the East India Company's army, but spread to include diverse participants with various grievances against company rule. Religious concerns, fears about cultural erosion, economic hardships, and opposition to territorial annexations all contributed to the rebellion, which was eventually suppressed with considerable brutality on both sides. The consequences of 1857 were far-reaching. The East India Company was abolished, with governance of India transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation promised non-interference with religious beliefs and equal treatment under the law, seeking to address some of the grievances that had fueled the rebellion. Yet British rule became in some ways more entrenched and self-conscious, with greater separation between rulers and ruled. The events of 1857 lingered in collective memory, shaping both British imperial policy and Indian nationalist consciousness in the decades that followed. The latter half of the 19th century saw the emergence of more organized forms of resistance to imperial rule in various parts of the empire. In India, the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked the beginning of a nationalist movement that would gradually evolve from seeking reforms within the imperial framework to demanding complete independence. Initially dominated by Western-educated professionals who admired British liberal traditions while criticizing their uneven application in the colonial context, the Congress became increasingly radical and broadly based over time. In Ireland, which occupied an anomalous position within the imperial structure, as a country both near to Britain geographically, yet culturally and religiously distinct, movements for greater autonomy gained momentum throughout the 19th century. The struggle for home rule, self-government within the United Kingdom, dominated Irish politics for decades, with figures like Charles Stewart Parnell building political organizations that challenged the authority of Westminster. Cultural nationalism flourished alongside political activism, with organizations like the Gaelic League, working to preserve and revitalize the Irish language and traditions that had been marginalized under British rule. Across the empire, indigenous peoples developed strategies to preserve their lands, cultures, and autonomy in the face of settler colonialism. In New Zealand, Maori leaders formed the Kyungitanga King movement in the 1850s, uniting previously separate iwi tribes under a Maori monarch who could negotiate with the British Crown on more equal terms. Despite these efforts, the New Zealand Wars of the 1860s resulted in significant land confiscations and the erosion of Maori authority in many areas. Yet Maori resistance continued through legal challenges, maintenance of cultural practices, and ongoing assertions of rights under the Treaty of Waitangi. In southern Africa, various African societies resisted the expansion of British control through both armed resistance and diplomatic maneuvering. The Zulu kingdom under Cetshwayo Kampande inflicted a stunning defeat on British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, though they were ultimately overcome by superior firepower and numbers. The Ndebele and Shona peoples rose against the British South Africa Company in what became known as the First Chimurenga, or First Liberation War, of 1896 to 1897, a precursor to the independence struggles of the mid-20th century. The Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 represented a different kind of challenge to British imperial power. Here, the resistance came not from indigenous Africans, but from settlers of Dutch descent, the Boers or Afrikaners, who had established their own republics in the interior of southern Africa. When these republics refused to grant political rights to British residents, Uitlanders, and resisted British expansion, a war ensued that would prove longer, costlier, and more controversial than London had anticipated. British tactics, particularly the use of concentration camps, where thousands of Boer women and children died from disease and malnutrition, generated criticism both internationally and within Britain itself. The resolution of the Anglo-Boer War ultimately led to the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. However, this settlement largely ignored the interests of the African majority, setting the stage for the later development of apartheid. The war revealed both the military strength of the empire at its height and the moral questions that increasingly surrounded the use of that strength. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, new forms of resistance emerged, informed by changing global ideologies and communication networks. Colonial subjects who received Western education often turned the principles they had been taught about liberty, equality, and self-determination against imperial rule itself. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings spread ideas of nationalism and anti-colonialism. Organizations formed to advocate for greater rights, representation, and eventually independence. The First World War marked another turning point in the history of imperial resistance. Colonial subjects served in large numbers in the British armed forces, with over 1 million Indian soldiers alone participating in the conflict. Their experiences, witnessing European vulnerability, serving alongside white troops, and sometimes being treated as equals in foreign contexts, often transformed their perspectives on imperial relationships. The rhetoric of the war, particularly American President Woodrow Wilson's emphasis on national self-determination, provided intellectual ammunition for anti-colonial movements throughout the empire. In the aftermath of the war, resistance intensified in many colonial territories. In India, the return of war veterans coincided with economic hardships and frustrated expectations of reform, leading to widespread unrest. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, in which British troops fired on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds, crystallized opposition to continued colonial rule. Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leading figure in the Indian independence movement, developing innovative tactics of non-violent resistance, or satyagraha, that would inspire future civil rights and anti-colonial movements around the world. Gandhi's methods, including the Salt March of 1930, which protested the British monopoly on salt production, demonstrated how seemingly simple acts could challenge imperial authority on both practical and symbolic levels. His emphasis on self-reliance, exemplified by spinning cotton by hand rather than purchasing British textiles, offered economic as well as political resistance to colonial rule. And his ability to mobilize ordinary Indians across religious, caste, and regional divisions created a mass movement that British authorities found increasingly difficult to control or ignore. Alongside Gandhi, other leaders emerged with different visions of Indian independence. Jawaharlal Nehru, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, articulated a secular, socialist vision for India's future. B.R. Ambedkar focused on the liberation of Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, from caste oppression as an essential component of true independence. Muhammad Ali Jinnah gradually came to advocate for a separate Muslim state, arguing that the interests of India's Muslim minority could not be adequately protected in a Hindu-majority nation. These diverse voices within the independence movement reflected the complexity of Indian society and foreshadowed the challenges that would emerge after the British departure. In Egypt, where Britain had established a protectorate during the First World War, nationalist sentiment crystallized around the Wafd Party, which demanded complete independence. Mass demonstrations in 1919 were met with military force, but the strength of Egyptian nationalism eventually led Britain to grant formal independence in 1922. Though British troops remained to protect imperial interests, particularly the Suez Canal. This pattern, formal concessions that preserved substantial British influence, would be repeated elsewhere as the empire attempted to adapt to growing nationalist pressures. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 marked a radical break with the constitutional nationalism that had dominated Irish politics. Though quickly suppressed, with its leaders executed by British authorities, the Rising became a powerful symbol of Irish resistance. The subsequent War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which established the Irish Free State as a dominion within the empire, while 6 counties in the north remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. This settlement satisfied neither Republican hardliners, who wanted full independence for the entire island, nor Unionists in Northern Ireland, who feared being incorporated into a Catholic-dominated Irish state. The resulting tensions would shape Irish politics for generations to come. Throughout the colonial world, The interwar period saw the development of what has been called the revolt against the West. Not simply political movements seeking independence, but broader intellectual and cultural challenges to Western dominance. Colonial subjects educated in Western traditions increasingly questioned the premises of imperial rule, arguing that concepts like democracy, equality, and human rights should apply universally, not just within European societies. They drew on their own cultural and religious traditions, while also engaging with global ideologies like socialism, Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Asianism to articulate alternatives to imperial order. In Africa, new forms of resistance emerged as urban populations grew and communication networks expanded. The Nigerian youth movement, founded in 1934, advocated for greater Nigerian participation in governance and eventually for independence. In Kenya, the Kikuyu Central Association, led by figures including the young Jomo Kenyatta, protested land alienation and sought to protect Kikuyu cultural practices, while also demanding modern education and political rights. In West Africa, the writings of Nnamdi Azikiwe highlighted the contradictions of colonial rule and called for African self-government. These diverse resistance movements faced significant challenges. Colonial authorities possessed overwhelming military power and did not hesitate to use it when they felt their control threatened. Economic structures, from taxation systems to labor regulations to trade patterns, reinforced imperial dominance and limited the resources available to anti-colonial forces. Cultural colonization, including educational systems that privileged European knowledge and devalued indigenous traditions, created psychological barriers to resistance that were sometimes as formidable as physical ones. Yet, despite these obstacles, the voices of resistance grew increasingly numerous and insistent as the empire entered its twilight years. They spoke in different accents and advocated different visions, but shared a common rejection of imperial tutelage and a common desire for self-determination. The empires of Europe had painted the world map in their colors, but beneath those imposed boundaries, alternative geographies of belonging and identity persisted, waiting for the opportunity to reassert themselves. As we listen to these voices from across space and time, we can discern the gentle but persistent undercurrent that would eventually transform the seemingly solid structures of imperial rule. Like water slowly eroding stone, these voices of resistance gradually reshaped the landscape of global power, preparing the way for the dramatic changes that would unfold in the wake of the Second World War. Their stories remind us that history is not simply the narrative of the powerful, but also the record of how the seemingly powerless maintained their dignity, preserved their cultures, and eventually reclaimed their right to determine their own destinies. The afternoon sun casts longer shadows as we enter a period of profound global transformation. The two world wars of the 20th century, cataclysmic conflicts that reshaped international relations, economic structures, and social hierarchies, marked a decisive turning point in the history of the British Empire. Like powerful ocean currents altering the course of a once mighty vessel, these conflicts redirected the trajectory of imperial power, transforming Britain from the confident global hegemon of the Victorian era to an increasingly strained and diminished force on the world stage. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, initially appeared to demonstrate the empire's strength rather than its vulnerability. Britain mobilized resources from across its global territories, with soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Caribbean fighting on European battlefields and in campaigns against German colonies in Africa and Asia. The conflict seemed to validate the strategic value of the empire, providing Britain with manpower, raw materials, and secure supply lines that contributed significantly to the eventual Allied victory. Colonial subjects served the imperial cause in various capacities. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain, with approximately 74,000 losing their lives. Australian and New Zealand forces distinguished themselves at Gallipoli, forging national identities in the crucible of war that were both connected to and distinct from their British heritage. African carriers supported military operations, often enduring harsh conditions and high mortality rates. The material contributions were equally significant, with colonial territories providing food, timber, minerals, and financial support for the war effort. In recognition of these contributions, the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa gained enhanced international status. They signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain and obtained individual membership in the League of Nations. The war accelerated their evolution from colonies to autonomous nations within the imperial framework, a development formalized in the Balfour Declaration of 1926, which described Britain and the Dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another. Yet beneath these apparent demonstrations of imperial unity, the war also sowed seeds of change that would eventually undermine the imperial structure. The conflict strained Britain's economy, beginning a process of relative decline that would continue through the interwar years. Britain emerged from the war heavily indebted, particularly to the United States, signaling a shift in the global financial center of gravity from London to New York. The human cost was equally devastating, with almost 1 million British dead, including many who might otherwise have staffed colonial administrations or developed new imperial enterprises. Moreover, the war altered perceptions about European civilization and its claims to superiority. The spectacle of supposedly advanced nations engaging in mutual slaughter on an unprecedented scale challenged assumptions about Western progress and moral authority. Colonial subjects who had traveled to Europe as soldiers or workers returned with new perspectives on their rulers, having seen them vulnerable, divided, and capable of barbarity that belied their civilizing rhetoric. And the war's rhetoric about making the world safe for democracy and respecting the rights of small nations raised expectations for reform that would be difficult to contain within imperial boundaries. The interwar period brought new challenges to imperial management. The Great Depression of the 1930s reverberated throughout the empire, disrupting trade networks and causing economic hardship that often fell most heavily on colonial subjects. In response, Britain increasingly adopted protectionist policies, creating an imperial preference system that sought to insulate the empire from global economic turbulence. This approach offered some benefits to certain colonial producers, but also reinforced economic dependencies that nationalists increasingly resented. The rise of fascism and militarism in Europe and Asia during the 1930s posed strategic dilemmas for an empire with global commitments but limited resources. Italian aggression in Ethiopia, Japanese expansion in East Asia, and German rearmament and territorial demands all required responses. Yet Britain's capacity to address these multiple threats simultaneously was constrained by economic limitations and domestic reluctance to rearm after the trauma of the First World War. The policy of appeasement, epitomized by the Munich Agreement of 1938, reflected these constraints as well as a desperate desire to avoid another devastating conflict. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the empire once again mobilized its collective resources. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers served, the largest volunteer army in history. Australian forces fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later in the Pacific. Canadian industry produced essential war materials, while its troops played crucial roles in the Italian campaign and the Normandy landings. African resources and manpower supported Allied operations across multiple theatres. This imperial contribution was vital to eventual victory, particularly during the dark days of 1940 to 1941, when Britain stood largely alone against Nazi Germany. Yet the war also exposed imperial vulnerabilities more starkly than ever before. The fall of Singapore to Japanese forces in February 1942, resulting in the surrender of over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops, dealt a devastating blow to British prestige in Asia. The spectacle of a European power defeated by an Asian one undermined the racial hierarchies that had implicitly supported colonial rule. As one Indian nationalist observed, the mythical superiority of the white man had been broken. Japanese propaganda explicitly targeted colonial subjects, promoting the concept of Asia for the Asians and encouraging independence movements throughout the regions they conquered. While many colonial peoples remained loyal to Britain, seeing Japanese imperialism as merely an alternative form of foreign domination, the Japanese advance nevertheless demonstrated that European rule was not invincible. In territories temporarily occupied by Japan, such as Burma, Myanmar, Malaya, and parts of India's northeast, local populations gained practical experience of life without British oversight, experiences that would inform post-war nationalist movements. The pressure of war necessitated promises of reform and eventual self-government that would be difficult to retract once hostilities ended. The Atlantic Charter, issued jointly by Britain and the United States in 1941, affirmed the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, a principle that colonial nationalists eagerly embraced. In India, the Quit India movement, launched by the Congress Party in 1942, was suppressed. But the recognition that some form of independence would follow the war became increasingly widespread among both Indians and British officials. The war's economic impact accelerated the relative decline of British power. By 1945, Britain had liquidated many overseas investments and accumulated substantial debt, particularly to the United States. Its industrial infrastructure had been damaged by bombing, its shipping reduced by submarine warfare, and its export markets disrupted or lost to competitors. The financial cost of maintaining an empire of global scope seemed increasingly unsustainable, especially as domestic priorities like rebuilding housing stock and establishing a welfare state competed for limited resources. Moreover, the international system that emerged from the war was structured around two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, whose influence dwarfed that of Britain, despite its nominal status as one of the Big Three victors. Both superpowers, though in different ways, were unsympathetic to traditional European colonialism. American anti-colonial sentiment, rooted in its own revolutionary heritage and commercial interest in open markets, often conflicted with support for its British ally. Soviet ideology explicitly opposed imperialism, offering material and moral support to liberation movements around the world. The United Nations, established in 1945 as a successor to the League of Nations, provided a forum where colonial and formerly colonial nations could articulate their grievances and aspirations. As membership expanded through the process of decolonization, the General Assembly increasingly became a venue for challenging the legitimacy of continued imperial rule. International norms evolved to emphasize self-determination and human rights in ways that made traditional colonialism increasingly difficult to justify or maintain. Within Britain itself, the war's conclusion brought significant political change. The Labour Party, which won a landslide victory in the 1945 election, was more amenable to decolonization than its conservative predecessor, though pragmatic considerations rather than ideology would ultimately determine the pace and manner of imperial retreat. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government, preoccupied with implementing domestic reforms like the National Health Service, recognized that the cost of suppressing nationalist movements might exceed the benefits of continued imperial rule. The psychological impact of 6 years of total war also affected British attitudes toward the Empire. A nation that had experienced rationing, bombing, and the constant anxiety of potential invasion had less appetite for distant imperial adventures. The younger generation, which would provide the civil servants, soldiers, and business leaders of the post-war era, had been shaped by different experiences and values than their Victorian predecessors. Many questioned whether maintaining an empire was worth the human and financial cost, especially when domestic reconstruction offered more immediate and tangible benefits. For colonial subjects, the war crystallized existing nationalist sentiments and created new momentum for independence movements. Veterans returned home with enhanced status, organizational skills, and often a stronger sense of political consciousness. Wartime industrial development in colonial territories created urban working classes that would form crucial constituencies for nationalist parties. And the rhetoric of democracy and freedom that had animated Allied propaganda could be readily turned against continued imperial rule. As the dust of conflict settled, the British Empire found itself in a radically altered global landscape. Though still vast in territorial extent and formally intact, the foundations of imperial power had been fundamentally weakened. The self-confidence of the Victorian era had given way to a more hesitant and pragmatic approach, recognizing that the empire's future would likely involve managed retreat rather than continued expansion or even maintenance of the status quo. Like a tide that has reached its highest point and begun its inevitable ebb, imperial power was now receding, gradually at first, but with gathering momentum. The shadows lengthened across the imperial landscape as evening approached, heralding a new chapter in the relationship between Britain and its colonial possessions. The coming decades would witness the transformation of the world's largest empire into a voluntary association of independent nations, a process shaped by both British pragmatism and the increasingly insistent demands of colonial peoples for self-determination. As evening approaches, casting a golden glow across the landscape of our narrative, we enter the era of decolonization, a time when the vast edifice of the British Empire began to dissolve into its component parts. Like autumn leaves carried on a breeze, territories that had once been firmly attached to the imperial structure now drifted toward independence, following distinct trajectories but participating in a common seasonal change. This transformation, which would fundamentally alter the political geography of the world, unfolded with remarkable speed, condensing centuries of imperial expansion into mere decades of contraction. The phrase "winds of change" entered the lexicon of imperial history through a speech delivered by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to the South African Parliament in 1960. "The wind of change is blowing through this continent," he declared, "and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." Macmillan's words acknowledged a reality that had become increasingly apparent since the end of the Second World War. The old colonial order was giving way to a new international system based on the principle of national self-determination. The process began in South Asia, where the jewel in the imperial crown would be the first major territory to achieve independence. The British government, recognizing that continued rule in India had become unsustainable, appointed Lord Mountbatten as the last viceroy in 1947, with instructions to transfer power no later than June 1948. The deadline was advanced to August 1947, partly due to mounting communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims, and partly from a desire to complete the process before it could be further complicated by local politics. The outcome was partition, the division of British India into two independent states, India and Pakistan, with boundaries drawn hastily along religious lines. The human cost of this division was enormous, with approximately 1 million people losing their lives in communal violence and up to 15 million displaced as religious minorities fled across the new borders. The princely states that had maintained nominal independence under British paramountcy were absorbed into one or the other of the new nations, sometimes through negotiation and sometimes through more forceful means. Despite these tragic aspects, the achievement of independence represented the fulfillment of decades of nationalist struggle. Jawaharlal Nehru, addressing his nation as its first Prime Minister at the stroke of midnight on August 15, 1947, captured the historical significance of the moment. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. The independence of India and Pakistan was followed in 1948 by that of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and Burma, now Myanmar, completing Britain's withdrawal from South Asia. This rapid divestment of territories that had been central to the imperial project for nearly 2 centuries signalled that the process of decolonization was not merely a marginal adjustment, but a fundamental restructuring of Britain's global position and identity. In the Middle East, Britain's position had been complicated by the legacy of wartime promises, growing Arab nationalism, Zionist aspirations for a Jewish homeland, and the strategic importance of oil resources. The British Mandate in Palestine, established after the First World War, became increasingly difficult to administer as tensions between Arab and Jewish communities escalated. Following the Second World War, exhausted by the conflict and unable to satisfy the competing demands of the 2 communities, Britain announced its intention to terminate the mandate. The United Nations proposed partition of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, a plan accepted by Zionist leaders but rejected by Arab representatives. When Israel declared independence in May 1948, Britain had already withdrawn its forces, leaving the new state to defend itself against immediate attack from neighboring Arab countries. The resulting conflict established Israel's existence, but created a Palestinian refugee crisis and laid the foundations for ongoing regional tensions in which Britain would continue to be involved, though no longer as the governing authority. In Africa, the pace of decolonization accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, achieved independence in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, whose Pan-African vision extended beyond his own country's freedom to encompass the liberation of the entire continent. Nkrumah's success inspired nationalist movements throughout Africa, demonstrating that independence was achievable through political organization and pressure, rather than necessarily requiring armed struggle. Nigeria, Britain's largest African colony in terms of population, followed in 1960, as did Somalia and British Somaliland in the same year. Sierra Leone and Tanganyika, later part of Tanzania, gained independence in 1961, Uganda in 1962, and Kenya in 1963. In most cases, power was transferred to nationalist parties that had emerged from the educated elite, often following a period of internal self-government, during which local leaders gained administrative experience. The decolonization process varied in character from territory to territory, influenced by factors including the presence or absence of European settlers, the nature of local nationalist movements, the strategic importance of the colony, and the specific economic interests involved. In some cases, the transition was relatively smooth, with constitutional conferences mapping out a path to independence that was broadly acceptable to both colonial authorities and nationalist leaders. In others, the process was more contentious, involving mass protests, civil disobedience, or even armed resistance. Kenya represents one of the more complex cases. There, a significant population of European settlers had established farms in the fertile highlands, creating a society characterized by racial segregation and economic inequality. Rising frustration among the African population, particularly over land alienation, contributed to the emergence of the Mau Mau rebellion in the early 1950s. Though primarily limited to the Kikuyu ethnic group, this insurgency was met with a harsh counterinsurgency campaign that saw tens of thousands of Kenyans detained in camps where many suffered abuse. The suppression of Mau Mau was militarily successful, but politically counterproductive, generating negative publicity in Britain and internationally, while accelerating rather than retarding the movement toward independence. Jomo Kenyatta, though imprisoned by the British on allegations of Mau Mau leadership, charges he denied, emerged from detention to lead Kenya to independence in 1963, becoming its first president and adopting a surprisingly conciliatory approach toward the remaining European population. In southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the presence of a large and politically entrenched European settler minority complicated the decolonization process. When the white minority government unilaterally declared independence in 1965, rather than accept majority rule, Britain faced a dilemma. Unwilling to use military force against the settlers, but equally unwilling to recognize a regime based on racial discrimination. The resulting impasse was not resolved until 1980, following a guerrilla war and international pressure that finally led to elections based on universal suffrage and the establishment of an independent Zimbabwe under African leadership. The end of empire in Africa culminated in 1994 with the transition to majority rule in South Africa. Though formally independent since 1910, South Africa had maintained strong ties to Britain while developing an increasingly rigid system of racial segregation that became known as apartheid. International condemnation, internal resistance, and economic sanctions eventually forced the white minority government to negotiate a peaceful transition to democracy, with Nelson Mandela imprisoned for 27 years for his opposition to apartheid, becoming the country's first black president. In the Caribbean, the process of decolonization took a different form. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago achieved independence in 1962, followed by Barbados in 1966 and other islands in subsequent decades. Some smaller territories chose to remain British dependencies, balancing the desire for self-government with the economic and security benefits of continued association with Britain. The region's colonial legacy was complicated by the history of slavery and plantation economies, which had fundamentally shaped social structures, economic patterns, and racial hierarchies in ways that independence alone could not immediately transform. The end of empire also involved the return of the territories that had been acquired for their strategic value rather than as traditional colonies. The most significant of these was Hong Kong, acquired through a series of agreements in the 19th century and developed into a major commercial center. The lease on the new territories portion of Hong Kong was set to expire in 1997, making the continued British presence in the remaining areas impractical. Following negotiations with China, the entire territory was returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 under a one country, two systems formula intended to preserve Hong Kong's distinct economic and legal systems for 50 years. Similarly, Britain returned control of the Suez Canal zone to Egypt in 1954, withdrew from its protectorates in the Persian Gulf between 1961 and 1971, and gave up its last significant naval base east of Suez when it left Singapore in 1971. These withdrawals reflected both financial constraints. Britain could no longer afford to maintain a global military presence, and the reality that such bases were increasingly anachronistic in an era of sovereign nation-states. Throughout this process of imperial dissolution, British policymakers sought to maintain influence through less formal mechanisms. The Commonwealth of Nations, which evolved from the earlier British Commonwealth, provided a framework for continued association based on voluntary membership rather than constitutional subordination. Though lacking the formal power structures of empire, the Commonwealth offered a forum for consultation, cooperation, and the promotion of shared values, with the British monarch serving as its symbolic head. Economic relationships also outlasted formal imperial control. British banks, insurance companies, and trading firms continued to operate in former colonies, while patterns of trade established during the imperial era sometimes persisted. Sterling remained an important international currency, and London maintained its position as a global financial centre, though with diminished dominance. These economic continuities meant that decolonization, though real and significant, didn't represent a complete rupture with past patterns of interaction. The process of decolonization was not without its traumas, both for the colonized and the colonizers. New nations faced enormous challenges, building functioning state institutions, developing economic resources, addressing inequalities inherited from the colonial period, and forging national identities that could transcend ethnic or religious divisions. Some succeeded admirably in meeting these challenges. Others experienced periods of authoritarian rule, economic stagnation, or civil conflict that reflected both the difficult legacies of colonialism and the inherent complexities of nation-building. For Britain, the loss of empire necessitated a profound reorientation of national identity and international role. The country that had once ruled a quarter of the globe's land surface had to find a new place in a world increasingly dominated by superpower rivalry and regional integration. The transition was not always smooth, with the Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain's attempt to reassert control over the recently nationalized Suez Canal ended in diplomatic humiliation, marking a particularly painful recognition of diminished power. Yet the end of empire also brought opportunities for reinvention. Britain developed a closer relationship with Europe, joining the European Economic Community, predecessor to the European Union, in 1973 after initially standing aloof. It cultivated a special relationship with the United States, emphasizing shared language, values, and security interests, and it gradually adapted its diplomatic, military, and economic strategies to the realities of its post-imperial position, finding new ways to exercise influence within a transformed international system. As the evening light fades into dusk, we see the map of the world redrawn, with the pink and red that once denoted British territories giving way to the diverse colours of independent nations. The winds of change have blown through the imperial structure, transforming it into something entirely different, yet still connected to its past. The British Empire as a political entity has largely disappeared, but its legacy remains woven into the fabric of societies around the world, in systems of law and education, in patterns of trade and language, in architectural landmarks and cultural practices. In our final chapters, we will explore this complex legacy and its continuing resonance in the contemporary world. As twilight deepens and stars begin to appear in the evening sky, we turn to contemplate the enduring legacy of the British Empire. The ways in which this vast imperial project continues to shape our world long after the formal structures of colonial rule have been dismantled. Like a stone cast into water, the empire's impact ripples outward through time, touching shores far distant from the original point of contact. These ripples are neither uniformly destructive nor uniformly beneficial. They represent instead a complex pattern of influence that defies simple moral categorization. The most visible legacy of empire may be linguistic. The English language, once the possession of a small island nation, now serves as the primary global medium of international communication, business, diplomacy, and popular culture. Approximately 1.5 billion people speak English, the majority of them non-native speakers who have adopted it as a second or third language. The spread of English began during the imperial period, when colonial education systems prioritized it as the language of administration and advancement, but has continued and accelerated in the post-colonial era through the influence of American power, global media, and the Internet. This linguistic legacy has profound implications. For writers from former colonies, English offers access to international audiences and literary traditions, though sometimes at the cost of disconnection from local linguistic contexts. For businesses and professionals, English proficiency can unlock economic opportunities. For scholars and scientists, it provides a common medium for the exchange of ideas across national boundaries. Yet the dominance of English also raises questions about linguistic diversity, cultural authenticity, and the power dynamics inherent in communication that privileges some speakers over others. The legal systems of many former colonies draw heavily on English common law, with its emphasis on precedent, adversarial procedures, and certain conceptions of rights and obligations. Courts in India, Nigeria, Australia, and numerous other countries continue to cite British legal authorities, though they have developed their own distinctive jurisprudence since independence. This shared legal heritage facilitates international business and creates certain commonalities of legal culture across otherwise diverse societies. Similarly, political institutions established during the colonial period often survived the transition to independence, though frequently modified to suit local conditions. Parliamentary systems modelled on Westminster can be found throughout the former empire, from Canada to India to Jamaica. Civil service structures, electoral procedures, and constitutional arrangements frequently bear the imprint of British colonial governance, though adapted and transformed over time. These institutional legacies have provided frameworks for democratic governance in many contexts, though their effectiveness has varied widely depending on local circumstances. Educational institutions and practices represent another significant imperial legacy. Universities established during the colonial period, from McGill in Canada to the University of Cape Town in South Africa to the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean, continue to play important roles in their respective societies. Curricular patterns, examination systems, and even the architectural styles of schools and colleges often reflect colonial origins, though there have been ongoing efforts to decolonize education and incorporate indigenous knowledge systems alongside those inherited from the imperial era. The physical infrastructure created during the empire, railways, ports, irrigation systems, government buildings, churches and monuments, continues to serve practical purposes while also standing as tangible reminders of the colonial past. The railway networks of India, built primarily to serve imperial economic and military needs, now facilitate the movement of millions of passengers daily in the world's largest democracy. Colonial-era buildings house government ministries, museums, universities, and other institutions, their architectural styles often blending European and local elements in ways that reflect the hybrid cultures fostered by imperial rule. Urban planning and architecture in former colonial cities, from the wide boulevards of New Delhi to the grid patterns of central Melbourne, still bear the imprint of imperial design. These spatial arrangements were often intended to facilitate administration, showcase imperial power, or recreate European environments in distant lands. Today, they shape the daily experiences of millions of city dwellers, constraining and enabling particular patterns of movement, interaction, and habitation in ways that outlast the imperial intentions that initially produced them. Economic relationships established during the colonial period have evolved but not disappeared entirely. Some former colonies continue to trade primarily with Britain or with other Commonwealth countries, following patterns established during the imperial era. Certain agricultural regions still produce crops, tea, coffee, sugar, cocoa, that were introduced or expanded under colonial rule for export markets. Financial institutions with roots in the imperial period continue to operate globally, though ownership and control have become more diversified. These economic legacies include lasting inequalities, both between former colonial powers and their one-time dependencies, and within formerly colonized societies themselves. The extraction of resources, the disruption of indigenous economic systems, and the creation of export-oriented economies dependent on metropolitan markets created structural challenges that many post-colonial nations continue to grapple with. Yet the economic legacy is not solely negative. Infrastructure development, the introduction of new crops and technologies, and integration into global trading networks also created opportunities that some societies have been able to leverage for post-colonial development. Perhaps the most profound and complex imperial legacy lies in the realm of identity, how individuals and communities understand themselves in relation to others and to their own histories. Colonial rule created new categories and hierarchies, drawing administrative boundaries that sometimes corresponded to pre-existing cultural divisions, but often cut across them. It privileged certain groups and marginalized others, affecting social status in ways that could persist long after formal equality was established. It introduced new religions, languages, and cultural practices that became integrated into local societies through processes of adaptation, resistance, and synthesis. The result is a world of hybrid identities where simple distinctions between Western and non-Western, colonizer and colonized, traditional and modern fail to capture the complexities of lived experience. A young professional in Lagos may speak English at work, a local language at home, worship in a church established by British missionaries, wear clothes that blend Western and African styles, enjoy both Afrobeat and British pop music, and navigate social contexts that draw on both indigenous and colonial cultural codes. Such cultural hybridity characterizes post-colonial societies around the world, though its specific manifestations vary widely. Migration represents another important dimension of imperial legacy, with the movement of people from colonies to metropole and between different colonial territories, creating diasporic communities with complex relationships to both ancestral homelands and adopted countries. The substantial South Asian communities in East Africa, the Caribbean populations in British cities, and the multicultural societies of Canada and Australia all reflect historical patterns of migration facilitated or caused by imperial connections. These communities have transformed the cultural landscapes of their new homes while maintaining links to their origins, creating transnational networks of family, commerce, and cultural exchange. The legacy of empire also includes collective memories and narratives, stories that societies tell about their pasts and the place of colonialism within those pasts. These narratives are often contested, with different groups emphasizing different aspects of the colonial experience depending on their own positions and perspectives. Former settlers may focus on their pioneering efforts and achievements, indigenous peoples on dispossession and resistance, metropolitan Britons on the empire's supposed civilizing mission or its economic benefits to Britain, academic historians on structural patterns and comparative contexts. These competing narratives find expression in museums, textbooks, commemorative events, literature, film, and other cultural forms. Recent years have seen intensified debate over how the imperial past should be remembered and represented, with calls to remove statues of colonial figures, rename buildings and streets, repatriate artifacts acquired during the colonial period, and revise curricula to incorporate more diverse perspectives on empire. These debates reflect ongoing efforts to come to terms with a complex historical legacy that continues to shape contemporary identities and relationships. The Commonwealth of Nations represents an institutional attempt to transform the relationships forged through empire into a voluntary association based on shared interests and values. With 54 member states, most but not all of which were formerly part of the British Empire, the Commonwealth promotes democracy, human rights and development while providing a forum for consultation and cooperation. Though lacking the coercive power of empire, it maintains symbolic connections through the British monarch as head of the Commonwealth and practical connections through educational exchanges, sporting events like the Commonwealth Games, and various cooperative programs. Scientific knowledge and practice also bear the imprint of imperial history. Colonial botanical gardens facilitated the exchange of plant species across continents, sometimes with transformative ecological and economic consequences. Imperial surveys mapped territories, catalogued natural resources, and documented flora and fauna, creating knowledge that served colonial purposes, but also contributed to scientific understanding. Medical practices developed in colonial contexts, sometimes through ethically problematic experimentation on subject populations, informed global health approaches. These scientific legacies, like others, have both beneficial and harmful dimensions, reflecting the complex moral calculus of imperial power. In reflecting on these diverse legacies, we confront the challenge of ethical assessment. How should we evaluate a historical phenomenon as vast and multifaceted as the British Empire? Simple judgments, that it was either wholly beneficial or wholly destructive, fail to capture the complexity of lived experience across different times, places, and social positions. The empire brought technological development, but also exploitation, educational opportunity, but also cultural disruption, new political institutions, but also authoritarian control. Its effects varied widely depending on local circumstances, the period in question, and the specific policies implemented. Perhaps the most appropriate approach is neither uncritical celebration nor wholesale condemnation, but rather a nuanced understanding that acknowledges both the creative and destructive aspects of imperial rule while recognizing the agency of colonized peoples in navigating, resisting, and ultimately reshaping the imperial project. The British Empire was not simply imposed upon passive subjects. It was experienced, contested, appropriated, and transformed through countless interactions between individuals and communities with their own interests, values, and visions. As we reflect on this complex legacy, we might consider how it continues to shape our present world, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a living influence on international relations, economic patterns, cultural forms, and personal identities. The ripples of empire have not yet reached the shore. They continue to move through the waters of our shared global experience, interacting with other historical forces to create the world we inhabit today. In the gathering darkness of evening, as our story approaches its conclusion, we can discern the outlines of an imperial project that was once central to Britain's understanding of itself and its place in the world. That project has ended in its formal manifestation, but its echoes continue to resonate across continents and generations, a legacy as complex and multifaceted as the empire itself. Like all human endeavors, it contains within it the full spectrum of possibility, achievements and failures, cooperation and conflict, creation and destruction. A testament to both the creative potential and the moral limitations of the societies that built, maintained, and eventually dismantled it. As night falls gently upon our historical journey, we come to our final reflections on the British Empire, not as it was at its height, nor even as it unwound through the process of decolonization, but as it exists today in memory, in institutions, in landscapes, and in the lived experiences of people around the world. Like stars that continue to shine long after their light was first emitted, the empire sends its illumination across time, creating patterns that we still discern in the darkness of our present moment. Perhaps the most tangible echoes of empire can be found in museums, where artifacts gathered during the imperial period continue to provoke questions about cultural heritage, ownership, and historical responsibility. The British Museum in London houses collections from across the former empire, the Benin bronzes from Nigeria, the Parthenon marbles from Greece, the Rosetta Stone from Egypt, and countless other items that were acquired through conquest, purchase, archaeological excavation, or diplomatic exchange. These objects have become focal points for ongoing debates about restitution and repatriation, with claims that they should be returned to their countries of origin, met by arguments that they are best preserved and accessible in their current locations. Similar debates surround human remains held in museum collections, particularly those of indigenous peoples who were treated as scientific specimens rather than as individuals deserving dignified burial according to their own cultural practices. The repatriation of such remains, like the return of Saatchi Baartman, the Hottentot Venus, from France to South Africa in 2002, represents one form of reckoning with the more exploitative aspects of imperial scientific practice. The imperial legacy is also inscribed in urban landscapes through monuments, street names, and public buildings that commemorate colonial figures and events. In recent years, there have been growing calls to reconsider these commemorative practices, with some arguing that statues of slave traders or colonial administrators who presided over atrocities should be removed from positions of public honor. The statue of Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town was removed following student protests in 2015, while similar debates have surrounded monuments to figures like Edward Colston in Bristol and Robert Clive in London. These contestations over public memory reflect broader reconsiderations of how imperial history should be taught and understood. School curricula in Britain and former colonies have evolved to incorporate more diverse perspectives on empire, moving beyond triumphalist narratives focused on exploration and achievement to include experiences of exploitation and resistance. Public history initiatives, community archives, and oral history projects have sought to recover voices that were marginalized in official colonial records, creating more inclusive accounts of the imperial past. The literary imagination continues to engage with imperial themes, from the post-colonial writings of authors like Chinua Achebe, Salman Rushdie, and Jamaica Kincaid, to contemporary British novelists grappling with their country's imperial legacy. These creative explorations often focus on the complexities of identity in the aftermath of empire, the experience of living between cultures, languages, and traditions in a world shaped by historical forces of both connection and division. They offer imaginative spaces for considering what it means to be human in the shadow of imperial history, navigating both inheritance and invention in the construction of personal and collective identities. Former imperial buildings have found new uses in the post-colonial era, their meanings transformed by changing contexts and purposes. colonial administrative headquarters have become government offices for independent nations, while mansions built by imperial officials or merchants have been repurposed as museums, hotels, or educational institutions. These architectural palimpsests, where new functions overlay original purposes without entirely erasing them, symbolize broader processes of adaptation and appropriation through which formerly colonized societies have made imperial legacies their own. The Commonwealth Games, held every 4 years since 1930, with interruptions for the Second World War, represent a sporting manifestation of post-imperial connection. Athletes from across the Commonwealth compete in events ranging from athletics to lawn bowls, maintaining traditions established during the imperial period, while celebrating the diverse cultures and achievements of member nations. The Games provide a visible reminder of historical connections that have been voluntarily maintained and reimagined after the formal end of imperial relationships. Family histories also preserve imperial memories, with descendants of both colonizers and colonized carrying forward stories, photographs, letters, and other personal materials that connect them to this shared past. A British family might cherish photographs of ancestors who served as district officers in Nigeria or tea planters in Ceylon, while an Indian family might preserve accounts of relatives who participated in the independence movement or worked on colonial railways. These intimate, familial connections to empire create personal stakes in broader historical narratives, shaping how individuals understand their relationship to the past. Languages continue to evolve in ways that reflect their imperial history, with English developing distinct varieties, from Canadian to Singaporean to Nigerian, that incorporate local vocabulary, syntax, and pronunciation. Literary traditions in English from outside Britain often engage explicitly with the complexities of writing in what was once the colonizers' language, finding ways to make it express experiences and perspectives that were historically marginalized within imperial culture. The global circulation of these diverse Englishes creates new possibilities for communication across cultural boundaries, while also preserving distinctive local forms of expression. Religious communities established during the imperial period maintain their presence in formerly colonized societies, though often transformed through processes of indigenization and contextualization. Anglican churches in Africa, Methodist congregations in the Caribbean, and Presbyterian communities in South Asia have developed distinctive theologies and practices that reflect their cultural contexts while maintaining connections to traditions introduced through colonial contact. These religious expressions demonstrate how imperial legacies can be simultaneously preserved and transformed through active reinterpretation. International relations continue to be shaped by imperial history, with bilateral relationships between Britain and former colonies often reflecting historical ties of language, law, migration, and economic interconnection. The special relationship between Britain and the United States, though complicated by the Revolutionary break and subsequent American rise to superpower status, draws on shared heritage and maintains privileged channels of diplomatic, military, and intelligence cooperation. Similarly, connections between Britain and countries like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand remain particularly close, reflecting patterns of settlement and ongoing cultural affinity. Environmental legacies of empire persist in landscapes transformed through imperial intervention. Forests cleared for plantations, water systems altered for irrigation, non-native species introduced for agricultural or ornamental purposes. These ecological changes have often outlasted the political structures that initiated them, creating new environmental realities that contemporary societies must manage. Climate change, driven largely by industrialization that began in Britain and spread through imperial networks, represents perhaps the most significant and challenging environmental legacy of the imperial era, disproportionately affecting many formerly colonized regions. The ongoing management of imperial archives presents both challenges and opportunities for understanding this complex past. Colonial record-keeping was extensive but selective, privileging official perspectives and often marginalizing indigenous voices. Contemporary scholars and communities are finding creative ways to read these archives against the grain, uncovering experiences and perspectives that were present but obscured in the original documentation. Digital technologies facilitate wider access to these materials, allowing dispersed communities to engage with historical records that were previously confined to metropolitan repositories. Migration patterns established during the imperial period continue to shape demographic realities and cultural interactions in the 21st century. Substantial communities from former colonies, particularly from South Asia, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, have settled in Britain, transforming its cultural landscape while maintaining connections to their regions of origin. Similar diasporic communities exist in other former imperial centers, creating transnational networks that facilitate the flow of people, ideas, goods, and cultural forms across boundaries established by imperial and post-imperial political arrangements. The very concept of global interconnection that we now take for granted emerged partly through imperial networks of trade, communication, and governance. The undersea telegraph cables laid in the 19th century to connect different parts of the empire have their contemporary equivalents in fiber optic lines carrying internet traffic between continents. Global English, international banking systems, standardized time zones, and many other features of contemporary globalization have roots in imperial practices, though they have been transformed and extended beyond their original imperial contexts. As our narrative draws to a close, we might reflect on how the empire lives on not merely as a set of material realities, but as a complex presence in collective memory and imagination. For some, it represents a lost greatness, a project that, despite its flaws, brought certain forms of progress and connection to diverse parts of the world. For others, it symbolizes historical injustice, a system of exploitation and cultural disruption whose negative consequences continue to shape global inequalities. For many, it is both of these things simultaneously, a contradictory historical reality that defies simple moral categorization. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of empire is this very multiplicity of perspectives, the recognition that historical experience varies according to position, that power shapes both action and narration, and that the past continues to inform the present in ways that require ongoing negotiation and reinterpretation. The empire created conditions for encounter between peoples who might otherwise have remained strangers to each other, establishing connections that were often unequal, but nevertheless produced new possibilities for human interaction and understanding. As we drift toward sleep, carried on the gentle currents of historical reflection, we might imagine the empire not as a completed chapter in human history, but as an ongoing conversation about power, identity, culture, and connection. A conversation to which we are all invited to contribute, drawing on our own experiences and perspectives to make sense of this shared but differently experienced past. The story of the British Empire, like all human stories, remains unfinished, its meanings continually recreated through the act of remembering, its significance reinterpreted by each generation that encounters its complex legacy. In the darkness of night, as consciousness fades into dreams, the echoes of empire continue to resonate. In languages spoken across continents, in legal systems structuring diverse societies, in architectural forms dotting urban landscapes, in family histories connecting present to past, in economic relationships linking distant markets, in cultural forms blending traditions from multiple sources, and in ongoing conversations about justice, recognition, and reconciliation. These echoes remind us that history is never simply past, but always present in the structures and relationships that shape our shared world. And so, our story ends, not with empire's disappearance, but with its transformation, from a political reality to a historical memory, from an active force to a complex legacy. Like all great historical phenomena, it lives on in the world it helped to create, visible to those who know how to discern its subtle presence in the familiar contours of our contemporary landscape. As sleep finally embraces us, we might carry this awareness into our dreams, that the past remains alive within the present, that connections once established endure beyond their original contexts, and that the human story continues to unfold through countless acts of remembering, reinterpreting, and reimagining our shared journey through time. The end